Suppose Adam and Eve were humanity's original pair, and their offspring included only the sons Cain and Abel. So then, who precisely became Cain's bride? This mystery has captivated both faithful followers and doubting minds for millennia. Today, we're going to reveal the startling reality that the majority of people have never encountered. What awaits your discovery will fundamentally transform your understanding of humanity's opening chapters in history. And it concerns forbidden wisdom that's been visible yet concealed all this time. Before we proceed, though, if this channel is unfamiliar to you, think about clicking that like button and subscribing if you haven't done so yet. Your encouragement helps us keep creating these videos so you can expand your knowledge or simply relax. Additionally, share with us your viewing location and the current time where you are. We're cultivating a community right here, allowing you to encounter people who think similarly from every corner of the globe and interact in the comments section below. So, with no more delay, shall we begin? The puzzle presented in Genesis, asking that renowned question. At the start, a garden existed. Two individuals strolled among its trees, sampled its produce, and encountered no other people apart from one another. The narrative progresses with a straightforwardness that conceals its complexity. Adam and Eve, humanity's first man and woman, introduce offspring into a realm still pristine and young. Their initial son arrives with celebration. Eve gives him the name Cain, proclaiming that she has produced a man through the Lord's assistance. Not long afterward, a second son appears. Abel takes on the role of shepherd, tending flocks, while Cain cultivates the ground. Each brother establishes his position in this emerging world. The brothers present offerings before God. Abel chooses the best from his flock, the richest portions of the firstborn animals. Cain collects produce from his harvest, grown from the soil he works. God regards Abel and his offering with favor, yet Cain's sacrifice receives no equivalent approval. The passage offers no explanation for this. One gift gains acceptance, the other finds none. Rage builds within Cain's heart. His countenance darkens. God addresses him, cautioning that wrongdoing lies in wait at his doorway like a predator ready to attack. Control it, God instructs him. However, Cain fails to control it. Away in the field, removed from observing eyes, Cain attacks his brother. Abel's lifeblood seeps into the soil, wailing out from the ground where it fell. God challenges Cain with an inquiry. "Where has your brother gone?" Cain answers with phrases that resonate across the ages. "Am I the one responsible for my brother?" Yet the earth has already given testimony. The ground that absorbed Abel's blood now declines to give its productivity to Cain. A condemnation descends upon him. He will traverse the planet as an outcast, a perpetual wanderer without any location to name as home. Cain objects that his sentence surpasses his capacity to endure. Anyone discovering him will take his existence. God marks him with a sign, a symbol of safeguarding, guaranteeing that revenge will not catch up to him. Sevenfold, God pledges that anyone who injures Cain will encounter punishment. Following this, Cain departs. He travels away from the Lord's company, journeying to a territory named Nod, positioned to the east of Eden. The designation itself signifies wandering. In this location of banishment, something extraordinary occurs, something that has confused readers across thousands of years. Cain was intimate with his wife. The passage declares this plainly, without fanfare or clarification. She became pregnant and delivered a son they named Enoch. Cain constructed a city, naming it in honor of his son, creating a dwelling in the territory of his exile. However, pause and reflect on what the story has presented to us. Adam and Eve, humanity's first couple, their two sons, Cain and Abel, one brother now deceased, his blood absorbed by the earth, one brother banished, isolated in a faraway territory. And yet, abruptly, Cain possesses a wife. She emerges in the passage without any introduction, without lineage, without source. Who could she have been? From where did she originate? The inquiry hangs suspended in the atmosphere, requiring a response. At initial observation, the realm appears vacant, except for three individuals, Adam, Eve, and their exiled offspring. Abel lies in the ground, No additional names surface in the account up to this moment. No other families receive acknowledgement. Nevertheless, Cain discovers a wife in Nod, a woman who produces his offspring and assists him in establishing a civilization. The enigma intensifies when we examine Cain's personal statements to God. Following his curse, he declares that anyone discovering him could end his life. Anyone. This term implies others are present, individuals outside his direct family, who could come across him during his wandering. Who are these possible pursuers? Who inhabits this realm that appears, by the narrative's description, almost vacant? Across centuries, this inquiry has ignited discussion among researchers, religious thinkers, and inquisitive readers. Some brush it aside as an insignificant detail not deserving of focus. Others perceive it as a fracture in the foundation, a difficulty that jeopardizes the complete framework of scriptural truth. Yet others interpret it as an invitation, a puzzle component that discloses something meaningful regarding the nature of the passage itself. The inquiry reaches beyond mere curiosity about an ancient union. It extends into more profound territory. How should we interpret these ancient narratives? What do they convey about human beginnings, about kinship, about the essence of wrongdoing and its outcomes? Cain's bride becomes an entrance into more expansive spaces, each containing its particular questions and discoveries. Reflect on the ramifications. If Cain wed someone outside his family circle, this indicates other human groups lived concurrently with Adam's lineage. This prospect generates theological questions that spread forward across the complete biblical story. Were Adam and Eve genuinely humanity's inaugural pair? Or were they the initial members of a specific lineage, selected and distinguished? Does the narrative aim to portray all of humanity, or solely the ancestry of one population group? Conversely, if Cain married inside his family, this response creates its particular set of inquiries. Contemporary readers feel repulsion at the concept of such intimate unions. Our regulations prohibit them. Our biological understanding cautions against them. Yet the passage presents no worry, no heavenly ban, no indication that anything improper has transpired. Why this absence of comment? What might we be overlooking? The Genesis narrative moves ahead without interruption. Following the mention of Cain's bride, the account follows his descendants. Enoch produces a son, Irad. Irad becomes father to Mehujael. The generations progress, constructing cities, fashioning implements of bronze and iron, producing music with stringed instruments and wind instruments. Civilization springs forth from this banished lineage, complete with innovation, artistic expression, and social development. In the meantime, returning to Adam and Eve, the narrative observes that they produce another son, Seth, provided as Abel's substitute. Through Seth's descendants, the family tree proceeds, ultimately reaching Noah and further. However, between Abel's passing and Seth's arrival, what duration elapses? The passage remains silent. And what regarding other offspring, born throughout those unrecorded years? The story creates space for possibilities, for existences experienced between the written lines. This constitutes our starting point, an inquiry that appears uncomplicated on the surface, yet unfolds into depths we have not yet investigated. Cain's bride represents one of Scripture's most renowned enigmas, a woman lacking a name, lacking a history, yet essential to humanity's continuation as the passage describes it. The response, once we locate it, will demand that we interpret with attention, contemplate profoundly, and embrace multiple realities simultaneously. We will require comprehension of ancient viewpoints while responding to contemporary concerns. We will follow genealogies, scrutinize cultural backgrounds, and evaluate scientific findings. We will investigate theories spanning from direct to conjectural. However, initially, we must grasp precisely what the passage communicates, and equally significantly, what it fails to communicate. The Scripture offers hints dispersed throughout multiple chapters, awaiting attentive readers to assemble them. Cain's wife question cannot receive resolution from an isolated verse. The answer requires us to withdraw, observe the broader terrain of Genesis, and perceive how the components connect. The enigma starts here in Nod's territory, with a man and his unidentified bride. Yet the response will transport us considerably further backward, to the origin, and onward across generations, until we perceive the complete portrait that Genesis renders of humanity's initial days. Interpreting the passage, what Genesis genuinely communicates and omits. The solution to our inquiry conceals itself in obvious view, distributed throughout Genesis's opening chapters. However, locating it demands careful interpretation, observing particulars that superficial readers frequently overlook. The passage supplies hints, yet they arrive in pieces spread throughout various sections and incorporated within genealogies that contemporary readers typically bypass. Begin with Genesis chapter 1. Let us produce humanity in our likeness, God proclaims. The phrasing carries significance beyond its apparent interpretation. Humanity, not simply a man. The Hebrew term is Adam, which can signify both a personal identifier and humankind generally. God produces humanity, both male and female, blessing them collectively. Become productive and increase in number. The instruction goes forth. Populate the planet and bring it under control. This initial chapter displays creation in expansive strokes, rendering with a comprehensive approach. The sequence repeats. Evening and morning, successive days, illumination and shadow, ocean and atmosphere, vegetation and creatures, all materializing through divine declaration. Humanity emerges on the sixth day, formed in God's likeness, granted authority over all living entities. The chapter concludes with God examining everything produced and pronouncing it exceedingly good. Following this arrives chapter 2, and the viewpoint transforms, the perspective magnifies. Presently we observe creation through a more focused framework, concentrating particularly on the garden and its initial occupants. The Lord God shapes the man from earth's dust, introducing life into his nostrils. He cultivates a garden in Eden, positioning the man there to labor and maintain it. Trees emerge, attractive to observe and beneficial for nourishment. A river courses outward, irrigating the garden before separating into 4 headstreams. The creatures process before the man as he designates them. Nevertheless, among all these beings, no appropriate companion emerges. God induces profound sleep upon the man, extracts one of his ribs, and constructs a woman. The man awakens and acknowledges her. Bone from his bone, flesh from his flesh. She will be designated woman because she originated from man. Consequently, a man abandons his father and mother and unites with his wife. These 2 chapters operate distinctly. Genesis 1 provides a methodical, structured narrative. Genesis 2 delivers close detail, emphasizing relationship and intention. Researchers observe the separate literary approaches, the varying designations for God, the differing emphasis. Rather than conflict, these chapters supplement one another, presenting identical events from distinct perspectives. Following the garden, following the fruit and the serpent and the banishment, arrives the record of offspring. Cain emerges first, followed by Abel. The story documents their vocations, their sacrifices, the devastating result. Cain travels to Nod. Subsequently, as we have observed, he discovers a wife. Yet here's what most readers fail to notice. The passage has not yet concluded describing Adam's family. Chapter 4 informs us regarding Cain's descendants, following his lineage across multiple generations. Subsequently, in chapter 5, the story returns to Adam and commences again. This constitutes the record of Adam's generations. The chapter declares, "When God formed man, he produced him resembling God. Male and female he formed them, blessing them, and designating them humanity when they received creation. Adam existed 130 years and fathered Seth. Following Seth's arrival, Adam continued another 800 years, and subsequently appears the detail that transforms everything, and produced other sons and daughters. There it stands, declared openly without emphasis. Adam and Eve produced additional offspring beyond Cain, Abel, and Seth. The passage doesn't identify them. It doesn't enumerate them. It merely acknowledges their presence and continues. However, This solitary phrase creates the entrance to comprehending Cain's bride. Genesis 5 maintains this sequence with each generation. Seth existed, fathered Enosh, subsequently produced other sons and daughters. Enosh existed, fathered Kenan, subsequently produced other sons and daughters. The sequence continues throughout the genealogy. Each identified patriarch represents a lineage being followed. However, surrounding him exists a more extensive family structure, with branches extending in numerous directions. The lifespans documented in Genesis 5 astound the contemporary mind. Adam exists 930 years. Seth reaches 912. Enosh achieves 905. These prolonged lifespans signify overlapping generations, family structures that expand exponentially throughout centuries. If Adam and Eve produced offspring for even a portion of Adam's existence, and if those offspring similarly existed for centuries and produced their personal offspring, the population would multiply swiftly. Reflect on the mathematics. If Adam and Eve produced 6 offspring, and each of those 6 produced 6 offspring, and those 36 each produced 6 offspring, within merely 3 generations, we achieve over 200 individuals. Extend this throughout centuries with lifespans permitting considerably more offspring per couple, and the quantities expand exponentially. By the moment Cain arrives in Nod, the realm could contain thousands of descendants from Adam and Eve. The passage also suggests time's passage in ways simple to disregard. Between Abel's passing and Seth's arrival, Genesis notes that Adam reached 130 years old when Seth emerged. However, it doesn't inform us Adam's age when Cain received birth. Years, potentially decades, could have transpired between the garden banishment and the brothers' confrontation. Additional time could have elapsed between Abel's passing and Cain's departure to Nod. Throughout these unidentified periods, other offspring would have received birth, matured, and initiated families of their personal making. Genesis additionally mentions that Cain constructed a city. Cities demand populations. A city isn't 2 or 3 residences, but a community of individuals organized and established. Who occupied this city? The passage provides us Cain's descendants, yet a city indicates a more substantial population foundation. These individuals had to originate from somewhere. The genealogies themselves fulfill a particular function. Ancient readers comprehended the genealogies frequently compressed generations, emphasizing significant figures while bypassing others. The objective was not exhaustive family documentation, but following particular descent lines. Genesis pursues certain branches of the family structure while recognizing that other branches existed. Observe the arrangement of these initial chapters. Chapter 4 follows Cain's lineage through Lamech, demonstrating the advancement of culture, innovation, and urban existence among his descendants. Subsequently, Chapter 5 returns to Adam and follows a distinct lineage through Seth, ultimately reaching Noah and further. 2 family lines, 2 trajectories, both emerging from the identical source. The nations table in Genesis 10, appearing following the flood, pursues a comparable sequence. It follows the descendants of Noah's 3 sons, demonstrating how they dispersed throughout the planet and established different peoples. Again, the genealogy chooses particular names while recognizing a more extensive population. The objective isn't comprehensive detail, but demonstrating connection and continuation. What Genesis fails to communicate proves equally significant as what it communicates. The passage never asserts that Cain, Abel, and Seth were the sole offspring born to Adam and Eve. It never indicates the realm remained vacant except for this single family. It never voices concern regarding Cain discovering a wife or constructing a city. These events merely occur, documented without commentary. The absence of comment speaks significantly. If Cain's wife presented a difficulty in the perspective of the original audience, we would anticipate some clarification, some rationalization. Instead, the story proceeds smoothly past the detail, indicating that ancient readers grasped something contemporary readers require rediscovering. The passage additionally remains silent on certain prohibitions that would subsequently become regulation. Leviticus 18, composed considerably later, prohibits marriages between intimate relatives, brother and sister, parent and offspring, aunt and nephew. These unions become forbidden. However, in Genesis, before Moses, before the regulation, such restrictions don't exist. The passage documents marriages without evaluating their appropriateness. This silence doesn't signify complete permissiveness. Rather, it indicates that the regulations governing subsequent societies didn't apply to these initial generations. What became prohibited later was potentially necessary earlier. The passage trusts its readers to comprehend the distinction between prescription and description, between documenting what transpired and endorsing it as a permanent pattern. Genesis additionally incorporates the phrase, "and he died following each patriarch" in chapter 5. The sequence emphasizes mortality, the outcome of the garden banishment, operating its progression through every generation. However, before death arrives, life, years of existence, centuries actually, and throughout those centuries, offspring receive birth, families multiply, and humanity populates the planet as instructed. The hints remain there in the passage, awaiting readers to connect them. Other sons and daughters, extended lifespans, compressed genealogies, cities receiving construction, time passing unmarked between verses. Each detail contributes to the response, yet only when we withdraw and perceive the more comprehensive portrait. The scripture doesn't provide us a verse stating Cain married his sister or Cain married a daughter of Adam and Eve. It doesn't require to. The information exists in the framework, in the genealogies, in the sequences of ancient narrative. The original audience would have grasped. They understood how genealogies operated. They recognized that identifying 3 sons didn't exclude others' existence. Contemporary readers introduce different anticipations. We desire exhaustive information, direct declarations, responses articulated plainly. However, ancient passages operate distinctly. They anticipate active readers, individuals who will assemble hints, establish connections, and formulate conclusions based on the evidence supplied. The Genesis passage supplies that evidence. Sons and daughters born throughout centuries, populations expanding, families dispersing throughout the territory. The structure exists for comprehending who Cain's bride was and from where she originated. We merely require interpreting with attention, observing the particulars, and grasping the conventions of ancient genealogical composition. The response becomes evident when we focus on what the passage genuinely communicates, when we cease interpreting contemporary assumptions into ancient phrasing, and when we trust the story to supply the information we require, even if it arrives in unexpected manners. The straightforward response, sisters and intimate relatives, the direct interpretation of Genesis, indicates a uncomplicated conclusion. Cain wed a sister, or potentially a niece, an intimate relative descended from Adam and Eve. This response emerges organically from the textual hints we have assembled. Adam and Eve produced numerous sons and daughters. These offspring would have intermarried, as no alternative possibility existed in humanity's initial generations. For numerous contemporary readers, this conclusion generates immediate unease. Our societies prohibit marriages between siblings. Our regulations classify such unions as wrongful actions. Our biological understanding cautions of genetic dangers. The concept itself feels improper, activating visceral reactions shaped by present-day values and scientific awareness. However, we must grasp the ancient background before implementing contemporary assessments. The initial humans confronted a singular situation, one that would never repeat in history. They occupied the absolute commencement of the human narrative, in a realm where intimate kinship marriages were not simply allowed, but essential for humanity's continuation. The biblical passage displays no concern regarding these early unions. No heavenly prohibition surfaces in Genesis. No ethical evaluation accompanies the unions. The story merely documents that individuals married and produced offspring, pursuing the original instruction to become productive and multiply. The silence indicates that such arrangements, in this particular background and period, remained within acceptable parameters. Reflect on the timeline. Adam, fathers Seth at age 130, yet Cain and Abel received birth earlier, potentially decades before Seth. Throughout those years, and throughout the centuries that pursued, Adam and Eve continued producing offspring. By the moment Cain achieved adulthood, numerous siblings could have existed. By the moment he traveled to Nod, some of those siblings would have been adults themselves, capable of marriage and reproduction. Even if Cain departed immediately following the confrontation with God, traveling isolated to Nod, he would not remain separated for extended duration. Families multiply. Individuals migrate. His siblings and their offspring would disperse throughout the territory, some ultimately reaching the identical regions where Cain established himself. The planet's population, though modest by subsequent standards, would be mobile and expanding. The ancient Near Eastern background supplies additional viewpoint. In the realm of the biblical patriarchs, kinship marriages were ordinary and accepted. Abraham wed his half-sister, Sarah. Isaac wed Rebekah, an intimate relative from his father's family lineage. Jacob wed two sisters, Leah and Rachel, his cousins. These marriages transpired within extended family networks, preserving tribal and clan connections. While these subsequent examples involve more distant relatives than siblings, they demonstrate that intimate kin marriages possessed a distinct cultural significance in ancient periods. Family connections guaranteed trust, preserved property within the clan, and reinforced social bonds. The concern was not genetic, but communal, preserving identity and inheritance. The prohibition against intimate marriages surfaces later in biblical history. Leviticus 18, provided through Moses, creates explicit parameters. No man will approach an intimate relative to uncover nakedness. The chapter enumerates forbidden relationships: mother, sister, daughter, aunt, and various in-law relationships. These regulations create framework for an expanding society, safeguarding family integrity and preventing exploitation. However, Genesis precedes Leviticus by numerous generations. The patriarchs existed before the regulation, before these particular instructions received delivery. What subsequently became regulated was earlier left available, essential for humanity's survival and multiplication from a solitary original pair. The genetic concern that troubles contemporary readers merits careful focus. Inbreeding presently carries substantial risks. End quote. When intimate relatives reproduce, recessive genetic disorders become more probable. Harmful mutations that typically remain concealed can manifest themselves, producing health difficulties in offspring. Contemporary genetics has documented these dangers exhaustively. Nevertheless, the genetic situation of the initial humans would have been fundamentally distinct. Adam and Eve, if formed directly by God as Genesis portrays, would have possessed zero genetic defects. Their DNA would have been pristine, without the accumulated mutations that accumulate throughout generations. No harmful recessive genes would lurk in their genetic code, awaiting to produce difficulties. As their offspring married each other, the risk we associate with inbreeding merely would not have existed. There were no genetic defects to compound, no mutations to concentrate. The genetic difficulties we observe in contemporary inbreeding scenarios result from thousands of generations of accumulated errors in DNA replication. The initial generations possessed none of this burden. Throughout time, as mutations naturally transpired through normal biological processes, the genetic terrain transformed. Errors emerged. Copying mistakes accumulated. Environmental damage influenced DNA. Ultimately, intimate kin marriages would genuinely become risky. The prohibition in Leviticus, surfacing roughly 2,500 years following creation by traditional biblical chronology, arrives at a moment when genetic diversity has multiplied and mutations have accumulated sufficiently that such regulations become prudent. This progression makes biological sense. Commence with a genetically pure population, permit time for mutations to transpire naturally. Ultimately, reach a moment where intimate marriages concentrate those mutations dangerously, subsequently establish regulations to prevent it. The biblical timeline corresponds with this biological progression. Population genetics additionally supports the concept of humanity commencing from an extremely small group. The idea of a genetic bottleneck portrays situations where a population contracts dramatically, subsequently multiplies again from the survivors. Throughout the bottleneck, genetic diversity diminishes. Everyone descends from the limited number who survived. Intimate relationships become unavoidable. Whether the bottleneck originated from a literal Adam and Eve or from a small founding population, the genetic effect remains comparable. Intimate intermarriage becomes essential. As long as the founding population was genetically healthy, and as long as the multiplication occurs relatively swiftly, the population can recuperate and flourish. The biblical lifespans documented in Genesis 5 assist this recuperation. If individuals existed for centuries, each generation would overlap with numerous others. A solitary couple could personally witness their descendants to the 10th generation and further. Population expansion accelerates when multiple generations reproduce concurrently. What could require thousands of years with contemporary lifespans could transpire in mere centuries with ancient lifespans. Some researchers propose that the designation sister in ancient passages sometimes carried more extensive significance, referring to intimate relatives beyond literal siblings. In some backgrounds, sister could signify cousin or clan member. This interpretation would make Cain's bride a relative, yet potentially not quite as intimate as a full sister. The marriage would remain within the family of Adam and Eve's descendants, yet with slightly more genetic separation. Whether Cain wed a full sister, a half-sister, or a niece makes minimal distinction to the fundamental response. Regardless, he wed an intimate relative because intimate relatives were the sole humans who existed. The relationship would have been acknowledged as kinship by any definition. The particular degree of relation matters less than the fundamental reality. All humans in that early period descended from Adam and Eve. This response satisfies the textual evidence. It clarifies how Cain discovered a wife. It accounts for the population that could construct cities. It resolves the enigma without demanding speculation regarding other human races or pre-existing peoples. The passage informs us Adam and Eve produced numerous offspring. Those offspring married each other. Civilization expanded from there. The answer is direct. The response additionally respects the cultural and biological backgrounds. What appears strange to contemporary sensibilities was practical necessity in humanity's initial generations. What carries genetic risk presently posed no such danger then. What subsequent regulation forbade was earlier allowed. Comprehending these backgrounds eliminates the scandal and demonstrates the response's reasonableness. The genuine inquiry is not whether this response is accurate, but why it disturbs us so profoundly. Our reaction discloses more regarding our personal cultural moment than regarding the ancient passage. We introduce assumptions regarding genetics, ethics, and social standards that the original audience didn't share. Learning to interpret the passage on its personal terms, in its personal background, permits us to perceive the response that was perpetually there, awaiting our notice. Cain's bride was most probably his sister, potentially a niece, certainly an intimate relative. She was a daughter or granddaughter of Adam and Eve, component of the multiplying human family populating the planet as instructed. The passage doesn't identify her because her individual identity mattered less than the human lineage's continuation. She represents the subsequent generation, the living evidence that humanity would survive despite wrongdoing, banishment, and tragedy. Alternative theories, pre-Adamites and other races. Not everyone embraces the direct response. Across history, alternative theories have surfaced, attempting to clarify Cain's bride through distinct frameworks. These theories propose that other humans existed before, concurrent with, or separately from Adam and Eve. They envision a realm more occupied than Genesis appears to indicate, with multiple human origins rather than a solitary source. The pre-Adamite theory represents the most prominent alternative. This perspective proposes that God formed other humans before Adam, or that Adam represented solely one lineage of humanity among multiple. According to this theory, when Cain traveled to Nod, He came across these pre-existing peoples and wed one of their daughters. His apprehension of being hunted by whoever discovers me makes more sense, advocates contend, if the realm contained populations outside his immediate family. This theory possesses ancient origins, yet gained particular momentum in the 17th and 19th centuries. French theologian Isaac Laperere published a volume in 1655 contending for humans before Adam, utilizing it to clarify the presence of distant peoples newly encountered throughout the exploration age. How could all humanity have descended from Adam if populations existed in territories unknown to the biblical realm? Pre-Adamite theory provided a response. The concept attracted those pursuing to reconcile biblical narratives with emerging scientific and geographical awareness. As explorers charted new continents and came across diverse peoples, inquiries surfaced regarding human origins and dispersal. Could all races have descended from a solitary pair residing in ancient Mesopotamia? The time frame appeared too brief, the distances too substantial. Pre-Adamite theory supplied an alternative structure. Some variations of the theory indicated that Genesis chapter 1 portrays a general creation of humanity, while chapter 2 focuses to concentrate on Adam as the father of a particular lineage, potentially the Hebrews particularly. The individuals formed in chapter 1, they contend, established the more extensive human population. Adam, formed in chapter 2, became the father of the selected lineage through which salvation would arrive. This interpretation treats the two creation narratives as portraying distinct events rather than the identical event from distinct perspectives. The space between chapters, these interpreters assert, contains room for pre-Adamite populations who existed, married, and constructed civilizations before Adam surfaced on the scene. Cain, escaping from his family, would have come across these peoples and wed among them. Another variant indicates that Nod's territory already contained occupants when Cain arrived. The designation might refer to a region already established by others. Cain didn't discover an vacant wilderness, yet an established territory with individuals who received him despite his exile status. His city construction subsequently becomes collaboration with these existing populations rather than an achievement commencing from nothing. The theory additionally indicates Genesis chapter 6, where the sons of God take the daughters of men as brides, producing the Nephilim. Some interpret sons of God as Adam's lineage and daughters of men as descendants of pre-Adamite populations. This mixing of lineages, they contend, corrupted humanity and necessitated the flood, eliminating all except Noah's family, who preserved pure Adamic descent. Nevertheless, sons of God in Hebrew scripture typically refers to divine beings or angels, not human lineages. The section more probably portrays a mysterious union between heavenly beings and human women, producing giant offspring. Utilizing this obscure and contested section to support pre-Adamite theory constructs speculation upon speculation. More speculative theories venture even further. Some propose that God formed multiple races separately, each adapted to their specific environments. This polygenesis perspective indicates independent human origins in distinct parts of the realm. Adam's lineage becomes one among multiple, potentially the lineage selected for divine revelation, yet not the source of all humanity. This theory attempts to clarify racial diversity without demanding all variations to evolve from a solitary source. Distinct skin colors, body structures, and facial features would represent separate creative actions rather than environmental adaptations throughout time. Cain could have wed someone from a distinct human race, accounting for the enigma of his bride's origin. Yet another approach concentrates on Cain's mark. God positions a sign on him so that no one discovering him will strike him down. Some theories indicate this mark represented a visible racial characteristic, implying that Cain's descendants established a distinct ethnic group. His bride, originating from a distinct race, would have contributed to this distinctiveness. The attraction of these theories is comprehensible. They resolve the unease with intimate kin marriage. They supply ready clarifications for human diversity. They accommodate the sense that Genesis portrays a more occupied realm than a solitary family could produce. They correspond with contemporary unease regarding inbreeding and ancient concerns regarding other populations existing outside the selected lineage. However, these theories confront substantial difficulties. Most fundamentally, they conflict with the explicit declarations of Genesis itself. Acts 17 documents Paul proclaiming that God produced from one man every nation of humanity to exist on all the planet's surface. The New Testament affirms common descent, a solitary human origin. This theological point matters profoundly for doctrines of wrongdoing and salvation, as we will investigate further. The pre-Adamite theory additionally requires interpreting Genesis 1 and 2 as portraying separate events, when the passage displays no indication of this. The literary transformation between chapters reflects distinct perspectives on the identical creation, not distinct creations. Chapter 2 completes details that Chapter 1 summarizes. They supplement rather than conflict or supplement each other. Textual analysis discloses that Genesis 5 treats Adam as the initial human, the commencement of the human lineage. This constitutes the record of Adam's generations, introduces the genealogy, following humanity's narrative from its source. If humans existed before Adam, we would anticipate some recognition, some distinction between Adamites and pre-Adamites. The passage supplies none. The theory additionally fails to clarify why God would form Adam, especially if humans already existed. The garden story presents Adam as singular, the initial to receive God's breath, the initial to walk with God in Eden. This special creation loses significance if Adam was merely one human among numerous already occupying the planet. Geographic and linguistic evidence from the biblical passage additionally contends against pre-Adamites. Genesis 11 portrays humanity communicating one language until the Babel dispersal. If multiple races with separate origins existed, they would have developed distinct languages independently. The unified language at Babel indicates unified origin. The apprehension Cain voices regarding being hunted doesn't demand pre-Adamites to make sense. His personal extended family, expanding throughout years or decades, would have been adequate cause for concern. Brothers, cousins, nephews, all could pursue to avenge Abel. The apprehension recognizes a dispersing population, yet that population need not originate from a separate source. City construction additionally doesn't require pre-Adamite populations. Cities in the ancient realm could be quite modest, sometimes solely a few hundred occupants. What we would designate a village, ancient passages termed a city if it possessed walls and permanent frameworks. Cain's descendants, isolated, multiplying throughout generations, could create such an establishment. The theories attempting to utilize Genesis 6's sons of God confront the challenge that this section surfaces long following Cain, portraying events immediately before the flood. Chronologically, it cannot clarify Cain's bride. Additionally, the section portrays an aberrant event, something going improper rather than normal human reproduction. Constructing a theory of human origins on this strange passage is questionable methodology. Polygenesis theories indicating separate racial creations conflict with both biblical testimony and genetic evidence. DNA analysis follows all contemporary humans to common ancestors. Mitochondrial DNA, transmitted through mothers, and Y chromosomes, transmitted through fathers, both indicate shared origins. Distinct races share too substantial genetic similarity to possess separate origins. We constitute one family, variations on a theme rather than separate compositions. These alternative theories frequently surface from unease with the direct interpretation rather than from textual necessity. They resolve a difficulty that may not exist, at minimum not in the manner contemporary readers perceive it. The intimate kin marriage that disturbs us was not problematic in its original background, as we have observed. The theories additionally tend to multiply enigmas rather than resolve them. If pre-Adamites existed, from where did they originate? How did they receive creation? What transpired to them? Why does the passage never mention them directly? The theory generates more inquiries than it responds, violating the principle that simpler clarifications are generally preferable. Some perceive these theories as attempts to preserve biblical authority while accommodating scientific or social concerns, yet they genuinely undermine the passage by interpreting into it what it fails to communicate. Better to trust that the ancient composers understood what they were accomplishing, that they conveyed the narrative they intended to convey, and that the response to our inquiry exists within the passage as provided rather than in elaborate theories imposing outside structures. The alternative theories fulfill a function in our investigation. They demonstrate the range of thought on this inquiry. They emphasize the unease and concerns that drive individuals to pursue alternatives to the plain interpretation. They demonstrate that thoughtful individuals throughout history have wrestled with this enigma. However, ultimately, these theories lack the textual support and logical coherence of the direct response. Cain wed a relative because relatives were all who existed. No pre-Adamites occupy Genesis. No separate races receive acknowledgement. No concealed populations lurk in the passage's margins. The family of Adam and Eve, expanding and dispersing throughout the territory, supplies all the individuals necessary to clarify everything Genesis portrays. The theological ramifications, original wrongdoing, the image of God, and humanity. The inquiry of Cain's bride reaches outside historical curiosity into meaningful theological territory. How we respond shapes our comprehension of human nature, wrongdoing, salvation, and unity. The ramifications spread through fundamental Christian doctrines, influencing how we interpret not merely Genesis, yet the complete biblical story. Commence with the doctrine of original wrongdoing. Christianity traditionally teaches that wrongdoing entered the realm through Adam's disobedience in the garden. Paul composes in Romans 5 that wrongdoing arrived into the realm through one man, and death through wrongdoing, and so death dispersed to all men because all committed wrong. This theology depends on universal human descent from Adam. If all humans follow their ancestry backward to him, subsequently all inherit the outcomes of his decision. The sister bride response preserves this unity. Every human descends from Adam and Eve. Their narrative is our narrative. Their decision influences us because we carry their nature. Wrongdoing dispersed to everyone because everyone originates from the source where wrongdoing entered. The theology remains coherent and established in shared human origin. However, pre-Adamite theory disrupts this structure. If other humans existed before Adam or concurrent with him, did they experience the fall? Were they subject to the identical instruction regarding the tree? Did wrongdoing disperse to them through Adam's decision, or did they remain untouched by the garden events? The inquiries multiply swiftly. If pre-Adamites didn't participate in the fall, they would be sinless, unfallen humans existing concurrent with fallen Adamites. However, Scripture knows nothing of this division. The complete human race stands under wrongdoing's power. Paul proclaims that all have committed wrong and fall short of God's glory. The universal scope of this declaration requires universal descent from the one through whom wrongdoing entered. Some pre-Adamite proponents attempt to preserve unity by indicating that Adam's wrongdoing somehow influenced all humans regardless of their origin. However, this makes wrongdoing's transmission mysterious and arbitrary. Why should Adam's decision influence individuals not descended from him? The inheritance model that Paul utilizes, where offspring share their father's nature, only operates if Adam is genuinely the father of all. The inquiry additionally touches the image of God. Genesis proclaims that God formed humanity in his image and likeness. This image-bearing defines human dignity and value. Every individual reflects the divine image, making human existence sacred and valuable. However, what if some humans descended from Adam while others derived from separate origins? Do pre-Adamites possess God's image? If so, how and when did they receive it? Genesis 1 declares that God formed humanity in his image, yet the background indicates a solitary creative action, not multiple parallel creations. If pre-Adamites lack the divine image, they would be human in biology, yet not in theological status. This generates a hierarchy that Scripture nowhere supports. The sister bride response avoids these complications. All humans descend from the pair formed in God's image. The image transmits naturally from parents to offspring through normal generation. Every individual, regardless of race or origin, possesses the identical divine image, because all follow backward to the identical source. Human unity and equality rest on common ancestry. Salvation theology additionally depends on human unity. Christ arrived as the second Adam, Paul teaches, reversing what the initial Adam corrupted. Jesus represents humanity before God, standing in place of the complete human race. His sacrifice encompasses all because he shares nature with all. He can be genuinely human because humanity possesses a solitary definition, a unified nature descending from Adam. However, if multiple human origins exist, which humanity does Christ represent? Does his sacrifice encompass pre-Adamites or solely Adamites? The inquiry becomes absurd when declared plainly, yet it pursues logically from pre-Adamite theory. The gospel's universal scope requires that Christ is related to everyone he rescues. Hebrews emphasizes that Jesus assumed human nature to represent his brothers and sisters. Brotherhood requires shared ancestry. The genealogies that follow Jesus backward to Adam gain significance from unified descent. Luke's gospel follows Jesus through David, through Abraham, through Noah, all the progression backward to Adam, the Son of God. This genealogy creates Jesus' position in human history, his connection to all who preceded. If Adam fathered solely one lineage among numerous, the genealogy becomes less significant, connecting Jesus to some humans, yet not all. The concept of federal headship additionally matters here. Theology speaks of Adam as the head of the human race, representing all his descendants. His decision bound them because he stood as their representative. Christ functions as a new head, a new representative whose decision brings existence rather than death. This parallel framework requires that Adam genuinely headed all humanity, not merely a portion of it. Monogenism versus polygenism becomes the technical distinction. Monogenism teaches solitary origin, all humans from one source. Polygenism proposes multiple origins, separate human lineages. Christianity has historically affirmed monogenism because polygenism undermines fundamental doctrines. The unity of humanity matters theologically, not merely historically. This unity additionally shapes ethics and human relations. If all humans descend from a solitary pair, subsequently all humans are literally family. The instruction to love your neighbor gains depth when you acknowledge that every neighbor is a distant cousin sharing your ancestry and nature. Racism loses any foundation when all racial groups follow backward to the identical source. We constitute one human family, variations within a unity rather than separate categories. The sister bride response supports this unity. The marriage of intimate relatives in the initial generations guaranteed that all subsequent humans would share tight genetic and familial bonds. There are no separate races in the sense of distinct species or origins. Every human carries the identical fundamental nature because every human originates from the identical trunk, even if we presently disperse throughout numerous branches. Pre-Adamite theory, by contrast, can enable racist thinking. If distinct populations possess distinct origins, potentially they possess distinct natures, distinct value, distinct destinies. History demonstrates that polygenist concepts have been utilized to rationalize oppression and discrimination. While not all pre-Adamite proponents intend such conclusions, the theory creates entrances that monogenism keeps secured. The timing of regulation regarding marriage additionally carries theological significance. God provided the prohibition against intimate kin marriage through Moses centuries following the initial generations. This indicates that such unions were acceptable in earlier periods, yet became inappropriate once population and genetic diversity multiplied. God's regulations adapt to circumstances while preserving consistent moral principles. This progressive revelation corresponds to a theological sequence. God didn't provide all his instructions at once, yet disclosed his will gradually, suited to humanity's situation and capacity. Early generations existed under general principles. Subsequent generations received more particular regulations. The Mosaic regulation represented a specific covenant for a specific people at a specific period. Some of its instructions apply universally, others particularly. Marriage regulations fall partially in the category of situational instructions. The fundamental principle remains constant. Marriage should be faithful, productive, and pursue appropriate parameters. However, what parameters are appropriate depends on circumstances. When humanity was modest, survival required flexibility. When humanity expanded substantial, genetic health required restrictions. The changing regulation reflects changing conditions, not changing moral reality. This structure permits us to interpret Genesis without imposing subsequent standards. We need not be scandalized that early humans wed relatives when that was their sole option, nor need we conclude that such marriages would be acceptable presently when numerous other options exist. Background matters. God's wisdom accommodates human circumstances while guiding toward his purposes. The theological significance of Cain's bride extends to inquiries of providence and redemption. Even in exile, even following wickedness, even in a strange territory, Cain discovers a bride and constructs a family. Grace operates even in assessment. The human narrative continues despite wrongdoing. God's original blessing remains partially in effect. Become productive, multiply, populate the planet. Cain's descendants demonstrate humanity's resilience and God's ongoing care. Nevertheless, Cain's lineage additionally demonstrates wrongdoing's progression. His descendant, Lamech, becomes the initial documented polygamist, taking 2 brides. He boasts of revenge, threatening to repay any slight 77 times. The lineage moves away from God, developing innovation and culture, yet not righteousness. The genealogy follows both human achievement and human corruption. In the meantime, Seth's lineage, born to replace righteous Abel, walks a distinct path. Through Seth arrives Enosh, and in Enosh's period, individuals commence to call on the Lord's name. This lineage preserves relationship with God, ultimately producing Noah, through whom humanity receives a fresh commencement following the flood. These 2 lineages, Cain's and Seth's, both descend from Adam. Both demonstrate human nature's capacity for good and evil. Both demonstrate that humanity's narrative involves decisions, not merely origins. Theology must account for both the unity of human nature and the diversity of human decisions. All commence from the identical position, yet not all conclude in the identical position. The response to Cain's bride inquiry thus shapes how we comprehend human nature itself. Are we unified or divided? Do we share essential nature, or do fundamental distinctions separate us? The sister bride response affirms unity while recognizing diversity. We share origins, nature, and destiny. Nevertheless, within that unity, we make decisions that lead distinct directions. The theological stakes are substantial. Get the origin narrative improper, and you could get the salvation narrative improper too. Comprehend that all humanity establishes one family from one source, and you grasp why Christ's work can encompass all. Perceive that wrongdoing entered through one representative, and you comprehend why grace arrives through another representative. Acknowledge human unity, and you possess grounds for human dignity, equality, and brotherhood. These are not abstract theological puzzles, yet realities that shape how we exist, how we treat others, how we comprehend ourselves. The woman who wed Cain, unidentified and undescribed, stands at a pivotal moment in the human narrative. Through her, Cain's lineage proceeded. Through her example, we perceive the interweaving of all human existences into one great family structure. Her identity matters less than what she represents. The ongoing human narrative, complex and troubled, yet perpetually held within God's sovereign purpose. The historical and cultural perspective, how distinct eras responded to the inquiry. The inquiry of Cain's bride has received distinct responses throughout the centuries, each era introducing its personal concerns and viewpoints to the ancient passage. How individuals responded frequently discloses as much regarding their period as regarding the biblical story itself. The history of interpretation establishes its personal, fascinating narrative. The early church fathers approached the inquiry with relative simplicity. Holding firmly to monogenism, they generally accepted that Cain wed a sister or intimate relative. Augustine, composing in the late 4th century, addressed the issue directly in The City of God. He clarified that necessity required the initial brothers to wed their sisters, as no other women existed. He perceived no moral difficulty in this, given the singular circumstances. Augustine emphasized that what subsequently became forbidden was earlier required. The regulation prohibiting such marriages arrived through Moses, yet Moses existed long following these events. Distinct periods called for distinct practices. The significant point for Augustine was preserving that all humans descended from Adam and Eve, maintaining the theological unity necessary for comprehending wrongdoing and salvation. Other early composers echoed this perspective. They spent minimal energy on the inquiry, treating it as direct. Their commentaries moved swiftly past Cain's marriage, concentrating instead on the theological ramifications of his exile and the advancement of his lineage. The bride herself merited minimal focus beyond recognizing she must have been a relative. The medieval period continued this tradition, yet with added layers of interpretation. Medieval researchers loved allegory and typology, discovering spiritual significance beneath the literal passage. Some perceived Cain's bride as representing the church, joined to sinful humanity, yet producing spiritual offspring. Others developed elaborate theories regarding her designation and nature, drawing connections to other biblical figures. However, even with their allegorical tendencies, medieval interpreters preserved the literal response that Cain wed a relative. Thomas Aquinas, the great theological synthesizer, affirmed this perspective in his compositions. He clarified the biological and moral dimensions, contending that early generations confronted distinct circumstances than subsequent ones. His systematic approach helped create this interpretation as standard. Subsequently arrived the exploration age, and the inquiry gained new urgency. When European seafarers made contact with populations across the Americas, Africa, and the far-flung Pacific Islands, they encountered people who had existed in isolation from what was then considered the known world. These groups had developed their own unique cultures and physical characteristics. This raised a perplexing question. If all humanity descended from Adam, how could such dramatic differences exist? By what means had these populations arrived at their respective lands? At what point in history had they diverged from the biblical lineage? During this era, the pre-Adamite theory began to gain momentum as a proposed explanation. In 1655, Isaac La Peyrère published a work titled Pre-Adamite, which suggested that the humans created in the first chapter of Genesis were separate and distinct from Adam, who appears in the second chapter. This framework allowed for multiple points of human origin, which would account for the diverse peoples that explorers were discovering. The theory immediately stirred up controversy, leading to La Peyrére's condemnation by authorities in both the Catholic and Protestant churches. Nevertheless, the concept endured, attracting those who wanted to harmonize biblical texts with the realities of geographic exploration. Some individuals weaponized this theory to claim superiority for Adam's lineage, asserting that Europeans were descended from this special act of creation, while other ethnic groups originated from the pre-Adamites. This racist interpretation demonstrates how even sacred texts can be distorted to justify cultural biases and prejudices. The Age of Enlightenment introduced fresh challenges. Thinkers and philosophers began questioning established authorities, including the narratives found in Scripture. They subjected the Bible to rationalist examination, insisting on explanations that could satisfy logical reasoning rather than relying solely on faith. The puzzle of Cain's wife became a tool for skeptics who viewed it as a glaring inconsistency in the biblical narrative. Voltaire, among others, highlighted this mystery as proof that the Bible should not be interpreted as literal truth. Their reasoning went like this. How could Cain possibly find a wife when only 4 people existed on earth? They dismissed the sister-wife explanation as morally offensive and rejected the pre-Adamite hypothesis as lacking scriptural foundation. In their view, this question proved that Genesis was mythological storytelling, not historical record. Christian defenders responded by meticulously presenting the textual evidence for additional offspring of Adam and Eve. They stressed the importance of cultural context and made the case for why early close-kin marriages were biologically viable. This exchange sharpened the interpretive tools on both sides, requiring more rigorous textual analysis and more comprehensive engagement with criticisms. The 19th century ushered in evolutionary theory, which fundamentally transformed the entire discussion. Darwin's Origin of Species introduced natural selection as the driving force behind the diversity of living things. When this concept was extended to human beings, it implied that we had evolved from earlier species across immense spans of time. The question surrounding Cain's wife became intertwined with larger debates concerning evolution, creation, and whether Genesis should be read as historical fact. Certain Christians made attempts to reconcile evolutionary thought with Genesis. They proposed that Adam marked the moment when God bestowed souls or special divine revelation upon pre-existing hominids. Under this framework, Cain would have married one of these ensouled humans who descended from the same evolutionary pathway, but not necessarily directly from Adam. This position sought to preserve theological cohesion while accepting scientific discoveries. Other Christians completely rejected evolutionary theory, championing a literal six-day creation and a young earth timeline. For these believers, the sister-wife explanation remained the clear and only biblically sound position. They perceived any compromise with evolution as hazardous, threatening both scriptural authority and fundamental doctrines. The 20th century introduced genetic science into the conversation. The discovery of DNA, followed by the mapping of human genetics, furnished new instruments for investigating human origins. Genetic research enabled scientists to trace ancestral lines, identify patterns of migration, and calculate population sizes throughout different historical periods. This information entered the ongoing dialogue about Adam, Eve, and where humanity came from. Some geneticists concluded that the genetic diversity found in humans necessitates descent from a population numbering at least several thousand individuals rather than from just two people. This posed a direct challenge to traditional readings. Others countered that genetic diversity could develop rapidly through mutations, or that a literal Adam and Eve would represent a population bottleneck that might be undetectable by genetic analysis when looking so far into the past. More recent research involving mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes has revealed that all living humans can trace their lineage back to common ancestors, often referred to as mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam. Although these scientific figures existed at different points in time and were not an actual married couple, their existence demonstrates that human ancestry narrows down to fewer individuals the further back you trace it. This offers some validation for the concept of descent from a small founding group. Various Christian traditions have emphasized different aspects throughout this historical journey. Roman Catholic teaching has persistently affirmed monogenism, viewing it as essential to the doctrine of original sin. The Church has exercised caution regarding interpretations that might undermine human unity. Protestant denominations display greater variety, with some upholding strictly literal interpretations, while others permit more adaptable approaches. Jewish interpretation carries its own distinct history with this question. Ancient rabbinical sources accepted that Cain took a sister as his wife, frequently adding traditions about her name and personality. The Talmud and other Jewish writings expand upon Genesis, filling in gaps with narratives that became woven into Jewish tradition, even though they are not considered canonical scripture. These traditions illustrate how religious communities elaborate on biblical stories to address enduring questions. Orthodox Christianity, which maintains strong ties to the Church Fathers, has largely continued their interpretive methodology. The sister-wife explanation remains the standard position, with particular emphasis on the theological significance of unified descent from Adam. Orthodox theologians tend to place less emphasis on harmonizing Genesis with contemporary science, concentrating instead on preserving traditional understanding. What this historical overview makes clear is that the sister-wife answer has predominated throughout most of Christian history. Pre-Adamite theories and other alternative explanations arose in response to particular historical pressures, but never supplanted the traditional perspective in mainstream theological circles. Whenever the question received serious scholarly attention, the straightforward interpretation of Genesis as describing close-kin marriages during early generations has prevailed. Different historical periods revealed different areas of concern. Ancient interpreters focused on theology and moral consistency. Medieval scholars layered on spiritual symbolism and meaning. The Age of Exploration and the Enlightenment raised questions about human unity and biblical credibility. Contemporary readers wrestle with genetics and evolutionary theory. Each generation brings its own set of questions to the text, and the text provides answers appropriate to those inquiries. Yet underneath these shifting concerns, the fundamental facts remain unchanged. Genesis portrays Adam and Eve as having numerous children. These children would naturally have married one another. Cain found his wife within his extended family network. The narrative records this matter-of-factly because the original audience understood these family dynamics. Our task is not to impose new meanings on the text, but to recover what it has always communicated, reading with eyes trained through both diligent study and historical perspective. The history of biblical interpretation teaches us humility. We are not breaking new ground with these questions. Exceptional minds, spanning thousands of years, have grappled with this very text. We build upon their work, gaining from their wisdom while also recognizing their blind spots. Our own conclusions will similarly be both valuable and incomplete, serving our contemporary moment while future generations arrive with fresh questions and insights. Now, let's turn to the scientific perspective. Genetics, anthropology, and the concept of a human population bottleneck. Modern science provides analytical tools that ancient readers could never have conceived of. We can examine DNA sequences, follow genetic markers across different populations, chart human migration routes, and estimate when various groups separated from one another. This scientific information intersects with the biblical narrative in intricate ways, at times reinforcing and at times challenging established interpretations. Let's begin with human genetic diversity. When geneticists analyze DNA across populations around the world, they discover extraordinary similarity. Any two random humans share approximately 99.9% of their DNA. The variations that produce what we perceive as racial differences occupy only a minuscule portion of our genetic code. This profound uniformity points toward recent common ancestry, at least in evolutionary timescales. Genetic research also demonstrates that humans possess less genetic diversity compared to many other species. Chimpanzees, despite being far fewer in total number than humans, display greater genetic variation throughout their populations. This pattern suggests that humans experienced a genetic bottleneck, a period when our population contracted dramatically, thereby reducing overall diversity. The individuals who survived this bottleneck event became the ancestors of all people living today. The bottleneck concept aligns intriguingly with biblical accounts. Whether that bottleneck was Adam and Eve, the family of Noah, or some other occurrence, the genetic evidence points to all modern humans descending from a relatively limited ancestral group. The scholarly debate focuses on questions of timing and population size, not on whether such convergence actually happened. Mitochondrial DNA offers one avenue of evidence. This genetic material transfers from mothers to their offspring with minimal changes, slowly accumulating mutations across time. By comparing mitochondrial DNA samples from different populations and calculating the rate of mutation, scientists can estimate when various groups last shared a common maternal ancestor. This analysis points backward to a woman who lived somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago, sometimes called mitochondrial Eve. An important clarification is needed here. Mitochondrial Eve was not the sole woman living during her time. She simply represents the woman from whom all present-day mitochondrial DNA has descended. Other women existed alongside her, but their mitochondrial lineages eventually disappeared, having produced only male offspring in certain generations who could not transmit mitochondrial DNA forward. Only mitochondrial Eve's line persisted to the present through an uninterrupted chain of daughters. Y chromosome analysis provides a complementary line of investigation. This genetic material passes from fathers to sons. Comparable analysis traces all contemporary Y chromosomes back to a man who lived roughly 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, sometimes called Y chromosomal Adam. Once again, he was not the only male alive during his era, but rather the one whose Y chromosome lineage survived, while other lines died out. These two individuals did not exist during the same time period and were not a married pair. The labels mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam regrettably create misunderstanding by mirroring the biblical names. They represent points where genetic lines converge, not literal first parents. Their existence does confirm that tracing lineages backward leads to fewer and fewer ancestors, but the time frames and mechanisms differ substantially from traditional biblical chronology. The genetic data additionally reveals patterns of human migration. After first appearing in Africa, humans dispersed across the planet in successive waves. Different populations carry genetic markers that indicate when they branched off from other groups. The overall pattern shows division and movement, populations splitting apart and relocating to new territories across tens of thousands of years. These migration patterns raise questions about biblical timelines. Traditional calculations position Adam somewhere around 6,000 to 10,000 years in the past. Genetic evidence suggests that humans spread throughout the world much earlier than this. How can we reconcile these conflicting timelines? Multiple approaches have been put forward. Some Christians defend young Earth chronology by arguing that genetic mutation rates are not constant, and that dating methodologies rest on assumptions that may not be valid. They propose explanations such as created appearance of age, rapid diversification following creation, or other mechanisms that would compress the timeline significantly. This approach maintains a literal reading of Genesis, but requires rejecting the scientific mainstream consensus. Others accept ancient dates while reinterpreting the Genesis account. Perhaps the genealogical records in Genesis contain gaps, with son of sometimes meaning descendant of in a broader sense. This would push Adam further backward in time. Alternatively, perhaps Adam represents the point at which God granted spiritual consciousness to already existing humans, making him the first spiritually aware human rather than the first biological human. This position preserves evolutionary science while retaining core theological themes. A third category views Genesis as theological narrative rather than scientific documentation. They contend the text was designed to communicate spiritual truths about God, humanity, and the nature of sin, not to supply scientific information about origins. The story of Adam and Eve conveys that humans are God's creation, that we experienced a fall into sinfulness, and that we require redemption. Whether these events occurred literally as written matters less, in this view, than the theological truths they express. Each approach has both supporters and detractors. The ongoing debate exposes the tension between reading ancient documents on their own terms and incorporating modern knowledge. To what extent should scientific findings shape biblical interpretation? To what degree should biblical interpretation place boundaries on scientific conclusions? These questions reach far beyond Cain's wife, extending to the entire dialogue about faith and science. Population genetics introduces yet another dimension. Some research indicates that human genetic diversity demands that we descended from a population numbering at least 10,000 individuals, never falling below that threshold. If this is accurate, it challenges the notion of descent from a single couple. However, other geneticists contest these calculations, maintaining that population bottlenecks can be more extreme than the diversity suggests, particularly if followed by swift expansion. The discussion quickly becomes highly technical, involving mathematical modeling, assumptions regarding mutation rates, selection pressures, and population dynamics. Non-specialists find it difficult to assess competing claims. What appears clear is that genetic data does not conclusively eliminate the possibility of descent from a small founding population, though it does make such descent more complicated than a straightforward reading of Genesis might imply. Anthropology adds further perspectives. Fossil evidence indicates that modern humans first emerged in Africa and spread outward from there. However, other human species coexisted for extended periods, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. Modern humans carry trace amounts of DNA from these other species, proving that some interbreeding took place. How do these other human species fit within the Genesis narrative? Were they pre-Adamites, descendants of Adam but representing different branches, completely outside the biblical story? These questions highlight how scientific breakthroughs generate new interpretive puzzles. The authors of Genesis had no awareness of Neanderthals or DNA. They wrote from within their cultural framework, addressing the questions relevant to their original audience. We must be cautious about criticizing ancient texts for failing to address modern questions they never intended to tackle. Yet the biblical assertion of human unity remains pertinent. Despite encountering vastly different peoples, despite mapping genetic variations, despite uncovering extinct human relatives, science continues to confirm that modern humans constitute one family. We are all related, all interconnected, all descended from common ancestors, whether recent or ancient. This scientific conclusion harmonizes with biblical teaching about human unity and kinship. The genetic evidence for close relationships within human ancestry also speaks directly to our central question. If humans experienced bottleneck events, if populations were at times quite small, then close kin marriages would have been unavoidable. Whether the bottleneck involved Adam and Eve or some other scenario, biology and genetics demonstrate that human populations can rebound from extremely small numbers, and that close reproduction is sometimes necessary for survival. Research into genetic disorders also informs this discussion. Harmful recessive genes become problematic when close relatives reproduce, because both partners might carry identical mutations. But these mutations build up gradually over time. A newly created or very early population would harbor few such mutations. Close marriages would pose less risk in the earliest generations compared to later ones, after mutations have had time to accumulate. This genetic reality fits the biblical pattern we observed earlier. Close marriages were permissible in the earliest generations, but later became prohibited. As mutations accumulated, the associated risks increased, making the prohibitions prudent. The biological progression mirrors the textual progression from permission to prohibition. Modern science cannot definitively prove or disprove the biblical account. Science investigates natural processes and physical evidence. The Bible makes assertions about divine intervention, divine purposes, and spiritual meanings that exist partially outside the scope of scientific inquiry. However, science can inform our reading, helping us grasp what is biologically plausible, what the physical evidence indicates, and where various interpretations align with or diverge from material reality. The sister-wife explanation aligns well with genetic discoveries about human unity, bottleneck events, and recent common ancestry. It provides a mechanism for how humanity could expand from a small beginning point. It accounts for the genetic uniformity across populations. It fits the evidence that close family relationships characterized human ancestry at some stage. While scientific timelines and biblical chronologies may not align precisely, the broad outline of human origins from a small group finds corroboration in both accounts. Science reminds us that the question of Cain's wife is not simply ancient history, but touches upon our identity today. Every living human carries genetic testimony to our shared past. We are all related to one another, connected through invisible strands of DNA, extending backward through innumerable generations. Understanding our origins, whether through Genesis or genetics or both, helps us comprehend ourselves and our position in the vast human story. Now, beyond the mystery itself, why does this question matter today? We have journeyed through Genesis, evaluated competing theories, investigated theological implications, reviewed historical interpretations, and examined scientific perspectives. The evidence consistently points toward the straightforward conclusion. Cain married a close relative, most probably a sister or niece, descended from Adam and Eve. This answer satisfies the textual evidence, honors the ancient context, and aligns with both theological understanding and genetic science. But having resolved the question, we must pose a deeper one. Why does this matter? Who cares about the identity of Cain's wife, a woman who lived millennia ago, whose name we don't even know? What relevance does this ancient puzzle hold for people today? The question matters because it touches something fundamental about human identity. When we inquire about whom Cain married, we are truly asking who we ourselves are. Are we one unified family, or many separate groups? Do we share a core nature, or are we fundamentally divided? The answer shapes how we perceive each other, how we treat strangers, and how we understand our responsibilities toward distant peoples. The sister-wife answer affirms human unity in the most profound sense. Every single person you encounter, regardless of how different they may appear, shares your ancestry. We all trace backward to the same source. This is not merely poetic language, but biological and theological reality. We are relatives, however distantly, branches, growing from the same family tree. This truth carries ethical weight. When Scripture instructs us to love our neighbor, it is not asking us to love strangers. In the truest sense, there are no strangers whatsoever. Every neighbor is family, connected to you through chains of descent reaching back to common ancestors. The commandment to love becomes a call to recognize kinship, to treat all humans as the brothers and sisters they literally are. This reality confronts racism at its foundation. Racial differences are genuine but superficial, variations within a unified humanity rather than divisions between separate categories of beings. All racial groups share identical origins, the same essential nature, the same ancestors. No race can legitimately claim superiority because all races emerged from the same place. The visible differences that people have exploited to justify oppression and hatred are truly skin-deep, minor variations within a shared genome. The question also addresses human dignity. If all people bear God's image, and all descend from those originally created in that image, then every human life possesses infinite value. There are no lesser humans, no ethnic groups that matter less, no individuals whose suffering can be brushed aside. The image of God marks every face, from every race, in every place. This understanding shapes both ethics and politics. How should nations respond to refugees and immigrants? How should societies tackle inequality? How should individuals react to human need? The answer starts with recognizing that we are all family. What we do to the least among us, we do to our own kin. The binding force is not merely moral obligation, but actual blood relationship. The question also illuminates our approach to reading Scripture. The Bible is an ancient document written within specific cultural contexts, directed toward particular audiences. Understanding those contexts enables us to read accurately. We must not impose contemporary sensibilities onto ancient narratives or criticize ancient writers for not addressing modern concerns. At the same time, Scripture communicates truth that transcends its immediate context, truth that speaks to every era. Learning to balance both realities, reading texts within their historical setting while hearing their timeless message, becomes essential. The story of Cain's wife teaches this balance. We understand that close marriages were necessary during the earliest generations without concluding they are acceptable today. We acknowledge cultural differences without abandoning universal truth. We read with both historical consciousness and contemporary relevance. The mystery also reminds us to read carefully and think deeply. Superficial readings miss important details. Casual approaches overlook crucial clues. The answer regarding Cain's wife was always present in the text, but discovering it required paying attention to genealogies, noticing the mention of other children, understanding ancient literary conventions. Many mysteries that appear to challenge Scripture actually have solutions waiting for careful readers to uncover them. This encourages humility. When we encounter something in the Bible that confuses us, we should not immediately assume the text is flawed or self-contradictory. Perhaps we have overlooked something. Perhaps we need additional context. Perhaps the answer demands careful study and patient reflection. The extensive history of biblical interpretation demonstrates that questions once deemed impossible to answer have yielded to persistent, faithful reading. The question also demonstrates how theology and science can inform one another. Genesis makes theological assertions about human origins, nature, and purpose. Science investigates the physical processes, the genetic patterns, the material evidence. Both perspectives provide valuable insights. Neither perspective alone tells the complete story. Learning to integrate faith and reason, revelation and investigation becomes part of mature comprehension. This integration does not mean forcing agreement where genuine conflicts exist. Sometimes, biblical claims and scientific findings truly contradict one another, requiring us to weigh evidence and make informed choices about what we accept. But more frequently, apparent conflicts dissolve when we understand texts correctly and interpret data carefully. The question of human origins illustrates this dynamic. Both Genesis and genetics point toward human unity, common ancestry, and relatively recent emergence of modern humanity, even though they employ different vocabularies and emphasize different dimensions. The unnamed wife of Cain represents something larger than her individual self. She stands for all the people whose stories remain untold, whose names we never discover, whose lives seem insignificant within the grand narrative, yet her marriage mattered. Through her, Cain's lineage continued forward. Through her, a portion of human history unfolded. She reminds us that every person fulfills a role, even those who never receive recognition. This has pastoral implications. Most people feel insignificant, lost in the masses, convinced their lives don't matter. But the story of humanity encompasses every individual. Each person descends from those early generations. Each carries forward the human story. Each matters to God and to the ongoing drama of history. The unnamed wife of Cain matters because every person matters, whether named or unnamed, remembered or forgotten. The question also connects to hope. Despite sin, despite exile, despite tragedy, the human story moved forward. Cain found a wife, children were born, cities were constructed. Life continued onward. This pattern repeats throughout Genesis and beyond. Humans fail, experience consequences, yet receive grace to persist. God's purposes advance despite human rebellion. The wife of Cain bears witness to this persistence, this stubborn continuation of life even in the midst of darkness. Finally, the question invites wonder. After thousands upon thousands of years, we can still pose and answer questions about the earliest humans. We can read their stories, trace their family lines, understand their context. The ancient past connects to the present through chains of descent and transmission. We are not severed from our origins, but linked to them through both physical ancestry and textual inheritance. Standing at the conclusion of our exploration, we recognize that the mystery of Cain's wife opens into larger mysteries. Who are we? Where did we originate? How should we treat one another? What does it mean to be human? These questions carry far more weight than the identity of one ancient woman. Yet she helps us answer them, positioned at a crucial juncture in the human story, reminding us of our shared origins and common nature. The answer to our question is straightforward. Cain married a relative, part of the growing family of Adam and Eve. But the significance of that answer extends forward through all of human history, touching every person alive today. We are one family, one humanity, one story. Understanding our origins helps us understand ourselves and each other, seeing in every face an echo of that original image, bearing witness to our common source and shared destiny. This is why the question matters. This is why we ask and search and study, not merely to satisfy curiosity or solve ancient riddles, but to understand who we are, where we came from, and how we should live in light of our shared human story. The wife of Cain, unnamed but certainly not unimportant, stands as a marker of that story, pointing us backward to our beginnings and forward to our calling as one human family under God.